When we think about gymnosperms, kind of the iconic cast of characters that we think about of gymnosperms are the conifers. And if you think about how we use conifers or gymnosperms in our lives, they really fit these kind of specific roles, whether it be economic or cultural or horticultural of how we use these plants. And so really these conifers represent not only the majority of use of humans have for gymnosperms, but also the great diversity of gymnosperms that we have currently on our planet. Before we get into talking about what the conifers are, though, we need to pause for a second and think about some of the terms that we talked earlier in the semester about phylogenetics and how plants are related to one another. And a lot of times when we talk about plants, we're going to use kind of this term called a clade. And a clade is a good monophyletic group, so meaning all the species in that group share a common ancestor they're derived from. But the big thing about a clade is a clade doesn't have a hierarchical rank to it. A clade can exist without these kind of terms that we use, such as kingdom or phylum or class or order or things like that. And this is opposed to groups like orders or families, two groups that we're going to start talking increasingly a lot about as we kind of continue our journey through the plant kingdom. Orders and families, again, we have this hierarchical structure here, also share kind of a bunch of group of organisms that share a common ancestor, but orders and families have specific ranks. So your fast plants, for instance, that you're growing at home, they belong to the order Brassicales. And that order we know is a smaller group of organisms than the class, but it's a larger group of organisms than the family of the Brassicaceae. However, modern phylogenetics has shown us that a lot of what we assume to be an order might not actually have that good of a rank to it, or especially when we get to things like phylum and classes, that a lot of groups that share common ancestors might not actually share that common ancestor at the level we thought it did, or that hierarchy. And this is especially going to be the case with a lot of the gymnosperms and angiosperms that we'll be talking about for the rest of the semester. Gymnosperms in particular have been very problematic, and I'm going to say a couple of fairly controversial things today because of our ideas of clades versus these kind of hierarchical ranking things. For instance, really when we get below the kingdom level, when we get into the trachophytes, we have a lot of what we consider clades. So things like the spermatophytes, which are our seed plants that include gymnosperms and angiosperms, really don't have that traditional rank to it, and so we consider it a clade, especially when we get into the group that we call the gymnosperms. They clearly do share that common ancestor, and they're a good, legitimate taxonomic group, but they might not have that ranking, and we're not really sure how to include that in this kind of hierarchical order structure there. So to kind of show you a little bit of some of these problems, though, and is that when we look at our gymnosperms, the things that we have traditionally called the conifers really are kind of a mixed bag of a group. They include this order called the Pineaceae and another order called the Cupressus. Now, we don't consider this a good clade, actually. We actually would consider this paraphyletic, because if we wanted to say the conifers represented a good clade and were a clade on themselves, we would have to include this group in there too, because a good clade in taxonomy includes a common ancestor in all their descendants. And by excluding the natales up here, which include things like ephedra, we are kind of not considering a good clade. However, because of a lot of the traits that Pineaceae and the Cupressus contain in them, we generally like to use that term conifers because they do share some common relationship, obviously, together, but they also include a lot of traits that are very similar, especially these cones that they produce. Though the natales does technically produce cones. So of these two, so today what we're going to do is kind of go through these two big orders here and discuss some of the major genera and family that are included in these really important orders. The first one is the Pineaceae, and the Pineaceae is kind of an interesting little clade. It's probably one we're all very familiar with it. This is an order that really only includes one primary family in it, the Pineaceae there. And the Pineaceae is by and far the largest gymnosperm family. It's the most diverse. And it has about around 250 species in. When we get into the angiosperms, having 250 species in the family really isn't going to be that impressive. But the gymnosperms, having that many extant species, really makes it a special kind of well-diversified group. And the Pineaceae is a very important group, mainly for us because they are extensively found within the northern hemisphere. The boreal forest, which is a circumpolar life zone, is almost completely dominated by this big order and this family. Even beyond that, though, there are members of this group that do get into tropical situations, and especially up in higher elevations in tropical areas. This family is really kind of recognizable too because we see these needles born in kind of clusters or singly coming out from the stem, as well as these iconic pine cones, which are a series of reproductive organisms that have these kind of nice scales on them. They're very useful for identifying these species. We also see that they have very strong kind of bisexuality in them, where we have male catkins and female cones, and the males are going to release pollen, and the female cones will collect that pollen in order to fertilize. Within this kind of Pineaceae, within the single family Pineaceae, we have several genera that are really common that we run into a lot. Straight up, the first one, which the family and the order is named for, is the genus Pinus. Again, really iconic. We have them planted all over, pretty much anywhere humans have been. We've been planting pine trees. And by and far, they're one of the most important groups for our timber industries. They're easily recognizable by their needles being in these kind of fascicles, generally in groups of 3 or 5, though there are some exceptions of plants that have 2 or even 1 needle in this group. And of course, these kind of big iconic cones in them. Their cultural impacts on us, as well as their uses as humans, are really unrivaled within the gymnosperms. We get things like chemicals from them, especially things like pitch and tar, which was really the basis of some of North Carolina's economy and around the turn of the century, as well as just using them for timber, which is a common source of timber and pulpwood that we have. Closely related to the genus Pinus is the genus Larix, the larches. And Larix kind of occupy a really interesting spot in the gymnosperms. Larix are a very iconic species where I'm from in northern temperate areas, especially in these kind of waterlogged bog areas. And in the fall, they're one of the most beautiful trees because unlike a lot of these other gymnosperms we'll talk about today, they're not evergreen. They're actually a deciduous plant. And during the fall, they turn this bright orange or yellow as they take their chlorophyll back into their body and start shedding their needles. And in the spring, they'll regrow these. And because of this, these trees have really been popular ornamental quite a bit, and we've sent them all across the world. Within the family Pineaceae, the other two genera that a lot of people tend to get confused about quite a bit are the genus Picea, or the spruces, and the genus Abies, the fir. And these can look very similar to each other. In fact, they overlap quite a bit in their ecology. If you go into kind of up our mountains around here or into the boreal forest, really those areas are dominated by especially spruce, but a significant component of those forests are generally made out of fir. And to kind of tell them apart, especially when they don't have cones, can be a real challenge for a lot of people. Spruce, though, their cones are usually generally smaller and they hang down, where fir generally have larger cones that generally like to sit on top. Spruce also kind of more of an acrid smell to them when you crush the leaves and smell them, whereas fir tend to smell a little better. But probably one of the best ways to really tell these two genera apart is to look at their needles. Spruce needles are generally going to be pointy, hard, and short, whereas the fir are generally more friendly firs. They're usually a little softer and a little bit of a longer of a needle to them in general. But of course, with anything, there's always exceptions to these rules. The other good way to tell these kind of apart is that spruce needles will be a little more rigid. They'll have more sides to them. And so they'll generally have a four-sided appearance, whereas the fir is generally going to be more flat and have two kind of sides to them overall. So it's always best, if you're not sure if you're looking at a spruce or a fir, to really get that in hand and look at it from multiple different traits. Two other genera that are important to bring up when you're talking about conifers in North America is the genus Suga and the genus Pseudotsuga. The genus Suga is composed of the Hemlocks, and this is a very important tree in eastern North America and to some extent in western North America. Suga canadensis, the eastern hemlocks, is a dominant forest type in parts of kind of the upper Midwest and into the Northeast. And these forests are very distinct as these trees grow to large heights and really kind of prevent a lot of stuff from growing on the ground. And in these, a lot of the plants kind of just wait under these trees and wait for a tree to die so they can get their chance to grow up in a sunlight gap. Unfortunately, one of the big issues with Suga right now is that these extensive forests are being really on a high decline right now because of several invasive insects that are spreading diseases and killing off large, extensive stands of these plants. And it's going to be a really large conservation challenge that we need to face in the next 10 years. In Western North America, we have the genus Pseudotsuga here, especially represented by the Douglas fir or Pseudotsuga menensii. And this is a very common tree all throughout Western North America, especially in cooler, kind of shaded areas. And they're very distinct and iconic of the West, especially these kind of cones that have these very elaborate tongues that come out of them. The Douglas fir has an interesting name to it. Douglas was an important plant collector from Scotland that was collecting in the Pacific Northwest for a long time and described a lot of our plants. And his name is kind of honored with calling this plant Douglas, this fir. However, the Latin name Pseudotsuga menensii comes from another collector called Menens. And it's kind of ironic that these two are kind of united by this name for this tree because these two plant collectors hated each other. In fact, it came to such boil that Menens actually had to leave Western North America because he was afraid for his life. Unfortunately for Menens, his next landing was in Hawaii, where he was likely murdered because of essentially his prickly personality. The next big order that we consider the Cupressus the next big order of conifers we have is the Cupressus. And this is a fairly controversial order where not a lot of people actually accept it. Some people think that the Cupressus should be subsumed into the Pineaceae. And that gets down into some technical arguments about the relationship of the Ephedra group to these other different plants. But I'm a big proponent of the Cupressus, and I think the genetic evidence is very clear. And so you can use this fake phone number to please call me if anybody has a problem with this. The Cupressus, though, does really represent, and I think when looking at traits and not just genetics, a very clear monophyletic lineage. Many of these plants have reddish orange bark to them, and so they have this kind of iconic cedarish looking kind of bark to them. They also have very distinct rounded cones to them. So things like Distichum, which is planted on campus around here, have these kind of nice ball cones to them. And many of these cones are actually quite fleshy. If you think about juniper berries, which are not berries at all, but are fleshy cones, they can provide some juice to them almost. Though that this order isn't as diverse as the Pineaceae, there are about 140 species in them. And what kind of makes this a really interesting order is that they're extremely widespread throughout the globe. The Pineaceae is mostly found in the northern hemisphere, but the Cupressus has kind of a global footprint, if you will. Everywhere from the Himalayas down into the Sahara Desert, you can find representatives of this order. In fact, the highest elevation known woody plant is a member of the Cupressus, a juniper in the Himalayas. And even with this kind of differences in immediate areas that they occupy, they also have large physical presence, all the way from the boreal forest to down into Patagonia in South America. You can find representatives of these. The Cupressus has, again, that very large global footprint, and that's reflected in a lot of the families that it is. Families like the Arborvitae, which include the iconic Norfolk Island pine, which is one of my favorite potted houseplants, has been growing in kind of moderate areas in Mediterranean environments throughout the world, even though it's very much restricted to small islands in the Australia Pacific region. This kind of narrow distribution for that family is also found in this other kind of weird family that I'll admittedly don't know much about, the Podocarpiaceae, which are mainly, again, relegated to small island chains as well as into tropical areas of Southeast Asia. And we also see these kind of fleshy cones kind of popping up in this group of plants. But the two most important families for us here in North America are the Taxaceae and the Cupressaceae. The Taxaceae includes U, or the genus Taxus. And these have been highly associated with Christmas, especially because of their evergreen nature and their coloration. They're green, evergreen needles, and then these kind of red, fleshy cones that they have on them. And Taxaceae can be a very dominant component of a lot of ecosystems again, especially in the lower boreal forest, where these plants can, as shrubs, can take over almost the whole understory. With urbanization, one of the big stories with the Taxaceae is that these plants have been really kind of driven to near extinction in a lot of areas locally because deer and other ungulates really like to graze on these things. Interestingly, though, the Taxaceae is a very poisonous family for us, and ungulates are able to digest the chemical Taxol and filter it through their body, but you and I are not able to. Taxol is a very powerful cardiac drug, and eating these fleshy cones can be quite detrimental and almost fatal to your health sometimes. We've been able to use a little bit of Taxaceae, some of these purified compounds, to actually make drug treatments for people with cardiac diseases that we market as Taxol now. Beyond that, though, really, most of the majority in the Cupressaceae comes in the family Cupressaceae. And this is by far the most important for us economically within this order. The Cupressaceae is an extremely diverse and economically important group. We use it locally for lumber and also oils quite a bit. And they include things like cedars, and I put them in quotes because true cedars are actually belong in the pine family, but in North America, a lot of things we call cedars actually belong to this, as well as kind of some of our giant iconic trees are here, especially sequoia and the redwoods. But the big genera that we see a lot here in Utah are the junipers in particular, which are by far probably one of our most common trees that we have in Utah, and they dominate large swaths of the state. And these fleshy cones, again, are easily distributed by birds, as well as they have important oils that they contain that a lot of our essential oil companies like to take and market for human use. The Cupressus is the namesake of this family and a group of generally larger trees. The Cupressus is interesting because a lot of the species in it have very narrow ranges, but have been kind of spread throughout the world horticulturally. This individual right here, this is Cupressus macrocarpa, or the Monterey cypress, which is only known from 2 stands in the wild. But because of some of its attractive qualities as a timber species, has been widely planted around the world. In fact, it's kind of believed and talked about as being one of the most narrowly restricted native ranges that's been expanded the most. The genus Fusia is one of my personal favorites of this group. And these contain the white cedar, which is an iconic plant and an important ethnobotanical plant for many cultures in eastern North America. In fact, early French traders into North America called this plant Arborvitae, or the tree of life, because it was so useful for a lot of things. Particularly, it was really good for boiling the fronds or the needles on it to make a tea that would prevent scurvy and give you a good dose of vitamin C. And then, of course, those giant trees, the redwoods and the sequoias, belong into this family. So the last little review to give for this is that conifers are a polyphyletic group of gymnosperms, and that represent a couple diverse groups, the Pineaceae and the Cupressus, which are really important and iconic genera. And you know, with all trees we see, we often have these kind of weird personal connections with them in a lot of ways. We see them a lot similar to ourselves, especially some of these very iconic and long-living trees. This tree is a particularly important tree from the North Shore of Lake Superior, Minnesota, that I've gotten to know over the years. And it's also a very important tree for the local Anishinaabe tribes. And this tree, in fact, for some clans in that tribe, have really seen it as essentially a deity to them, because they have a long written history of this white cedar that's hanging out on these rocks overlooking one of the most important geographic features for them, Lake Superior.